All right, let's talk about electrons and how they're responsible for the interactions among atoms. It's the nuclei that provide stability, but it's the electrons that are dynamic. It's the electrons that occupy shells of increasing energy. And although the electrons occupy electron shells that are three-dimensional, we usually picture the electron shells as two-dimensional rings. And each shell has a specific energy. The farther from the nucleus, the greater the amount of energy stored in the electrons occupying that shell. Take phosphorus and sulfur, for example. They both have three orbitals, and it's the electrons in that third orbital that have the most energy. And when electrons capture and release energy, they can release that energy as heat or light. But they do move from a higher energy to a lower energy shell when they release that energy. And that energy, that dynamism, that's going to be important for how atoms and their electrons interact with other atoms. Because as an atomic number increases, electrons fill shells of increasingly distant from the nucleus. And that's because as atomic number increases, so does the electron number. And the shells nearest to the nucleus fill up first before the more distant shells. The shells nearest the nucleus can hold 2 electrons, whereas the shells that are more distant than that can hold up to 8, sometimes more. That's the rule of 8, or the octet rule. The electrons that fill the lower energy levels are closer to the nucleus. As the atom gets bigger and it has more electrons, it fills increasingly distant electron shells, but the protons and electrons are still going to be balanced. The reason we're talking about electrons first and foremost is not only because they're dynamic and they can gain or release energy, it's because most matter consists of atoms that are linked together to form molecules, not atoms all by themselves. And molecules are made up of 2 or more atoms. It could be 2 atoms or more of the same type, or different types. And atoms form molecules in order to become stable. They're trying to fill vacancies or missing electrons in those outer electron shells. So an atom can lose or gain or share electrons in order to fill those vacancies. But if an atom's completely happy with the number of electrons in its outermost shell, then it's considered inert or stable or non-reactive. Let's take a look at 2 different atoms. The one on the left, neon, is inert or unreactive. Look at its outermost shell. It already has 8 electrons. So it's qualified or completely happy with what it has, and it fits with the rule of 8. Its first orbital closest to the nucleus has 2 electrons, and its outermost shell has 8. So completely unreactive, not looking to form a molecule with any other atom. But sodium, on the other hand, is reactive. It may have 2 electrons in its first orbital, 8 electrons in its second orbital, but only 1 electron in its third orbital. It would really like to get rid of that electron or somehow gain 7. Getting rid of 1 is going to be much easier in order to have 8 electrons in its second shell only. So when we're talking about atoms and their electrons and how they interact, we're looking at those that are not stable. We're looking at those that are reactive. And we want reactive atoms to form molecules in order to stabilize themselves because those atoms that don't, called free radicals, are so reactive that they can actually damage DNA and tear other molecules apart. These atoms are actually going to be those that contribute to aging and even death. So let's talk about chemical bonds that actually hold atoms together and form molecules. There's 3 types of chemical bonds: ionic, covalent, and hydrogen. With ionic bonds, we're going to see the transfer of electrons. We're going to see some atoms lose electrons and some gain electrons. With covalent bonds, we're going to see the sharing of electrons. And when atoms share electrons, they get to count those electrons for both atoms. Some of this sharing is going to be sharing equally, and some of it's going to be sharing unequally. Hydrogen bonds are also going to be very prevalent when we talk about things like water, and specifically polar covalent bonds. But hydrogen bonds do not occur between atoms, they occur between molecules, so they're a little bit different from covalent and ionic bonds. So let's look at ionic bonds first. When ionic bonds form, at the end we'll have 2 ions, a positively charged ion called a cation, and a negatively charged ion called an anion. Ions have a charge. The way you can remember that cations are positive and anions are negative is think of cats and anions and having to rate those. If I had to rate cats and ants, cats are definitely going to be higher on my scale than ants. So they're going to be more positively rated than ants, which will be more negatively rated. When we're talking about ions, we're usually talking about opposite charges that attract, and that's really all that an ionic bond is. But they've been formed because of the transferring of electrons. One atom will have lost an electron and be more positively charged, and the other atom will have gained an electron and be more negatively charged. When you dehydrate ionic bonds, they form crystalline structures called salts, and that's why salts are a synonym for an ionic compound. So let's look at an example. Here we have sodium, which will donate its lone electron in its outermost shell to chlorine. That will give chlorine 8 electrons in its outermost shell, and now sodium will have 8 in its second orbital, which will become its outermost shell. That will make both sodium and chlorine happy with their number of electrons, simply because they transferred electrons. Sodium, which lost an electron and now has more positive protons than electrons, becomes positively charged, so it's the cation. Chlorine, which becomes chloride when it gains an electron, will become negatively charged because it'll now have more electrons than positively charged protons, so it's the anion. And when you look at sodium chloride in the crystalline structure that we call salt, you can see the lattice structure that's created where the sodium cations are attracted to the chloride anions. And that's what we see for ionic bonds. But covalent bonds, we're seeing sharing. We're not going to see the transfer or the loss or addition of electrons. Instead, with covalent bonds, the sharing is going to allow for either equal or unequal sharing. And that's what gives us two types of covalent bonds, polar covalent or nonpolar covalent bonds. With nonpolar covalent bonds, we usually see sharing of electrons that are between atoms that are similar sizes, or maybe just the same atom, like two oxygen atoms, two nitrogen atoms, two hydrogen atoms, or carbon and oxygen, which are roughly the same size. But when we see unequal sharing of electrons, it's usually because the atoms are vastly different in size. And that size difference is going to allow for a pole or a dipole to exist within that molecule. Polar covalent bonds are going to have a slightly positive and slightly negative side because of arrangement of their electrons. With a nonpolar covalent bond, again, we have similar sized atoms that share the electrons, and the protons in either nucleus are not going to exert more of a force on those electrons. So the electrons tend to hang out kind of equal near each nucleus. With something like water, which pairs two hydrogen with one oxygen atom, we're going to see polar covalent bonds form because one side is going to have a bigger pull on the electrons than the other. This oxygen nucleus has more protons than the nuclei of the hydrogen atoms, and so it's going to give a stronger pull on these electrons that are being shared, and they'll hang out closer to oxygen than to the hydrogen atoms, making the oxygen side slightly negative and the hydrogen side slightly positive. When you look at hydrogen bonds, you are looking at polar molecules, and you're looking at interaction of polar molecules with each other. Hydrogen bonds form between hydrogen and oxygen or hydrogen and nitrogen. We're going to use water as our example. Here we can see both hydrogen and covalent bonds. The covalent bonds are between the atoms, oxygen and hydrogen, and the hydrogen bonds are between an atom of one water molecule and the atoms of another water molecule. The hydrogen bonds are shown in red dots. The slightly negative side of this oxygen molecule up top is attracted to the slightly positive side of this hydrogen water molecule in the middle. So hydrogen bonds are quite weak. They can very easily be torn apart, but when they're in mass, when there's a bunch of them, they are a strong force. But if I was to rate the different bonds, I would say that covalent bonds are the strongest, followed by ionic bonds, and then hydrogen bonds. So before we move on, let's just review the different types of bonds. With an ionic bond, you're going to transfer electrons, whereas with covalent bonds, you will share electrons. When you share electrons, those electrons count for both atoms. Nonpolar covalent bonding is when we share electrons equally, such as two hydrogen atoms sharing electrons. Polar covalent bonds is when we share electrons unequally, such as two hydrogen atoms sharing electrons with an oxygen atom. The oxygen atom is so large that it actually pulls on the electrons being shared more than the hydrogen and keeps them closer to its nucleus, creating two sides, a slightly negative and slightly positive side. And hydrogen bonds are between oxygen and hydrogen, or hydrogen and nitrogen. And they're attractions that occur between polar molecules. They're going to utilize those slightly positive and slightly negative sides of polar molecules in order to create weak forces that in mass or in abundance are quite strong. For example, the hydrogen bonds in our DNA actually hold our bases together. It allows it not only to be a structure that's very stable, but also can be torn apart in order to read different genes to make proteins. So that's a quick look at all of the different bonds and more about the electrons for atoms. Next, we're going to be looking at why is water so important to life. So make sure to watch that video as well.